Wonderful to be here. It is a delight to be able to come all the way from Australia. So I arrived yesterday afternoon. So, if later on this afternoon you see my speed going a bit like this, you know why. But I think a number of you have travelled, so you probably know what that's like. So what I'm going to do today is actually give you an idea about innovation from a policy perspective. So picking up on what Annie actually touched on as part of the panel session, which is you actually need the innovators, you need the funders, but you also need the role of government. And I'm going to talk about different things we're doing in Australia around innovation from a policy perspective. So first of all, a bit about my role. My role is actually an innovation. It's a unique role. It is one where Australia is the only country in the world, apart from New Zealand, that has something similar. And the reason it's unique is I'm a ministerial appointment. So the actual Minister for Agriculture has appointed me to the role, but I'm an industry voice. So I'm a farmer myself, and I speak on behalf of industry. What this role does is it gives me very high access, particularly in global markets, to engage with either government officials or other high-ranking officials, but to bring that farmer voice, which is really important because quite often when you engage and when you're looking at policy debates, government officials, no matter how good they are at doing their job, they don't always know what works in practice. And if policy doesn't work in practice, you actually don't get the intended consequences. My role is also to build engagement with the multilateral organisations, so World Trade Organisation, OECD, FAO, but more and more, and this is my third year in the role now, it's become engaging with other global organisations to say, how do we actually work globally? Sustainability and the challenges of climate are a global issue, and so how do we work together and share what we're doing? It's also about demonstrating Australia stepping up in terms of its leadership in this area. And I have other roles in the ag sector as well. So apart from being a farmer, I also sit on a number of different boards, both in the agricultural sector and also in corporate Australia. So I'm going to start with just giving you a bit of a snapshot of the size of Australia. So Australia is a huge country. It's massive. It's 21 times the size of Germany. Although we're only a third of the population, it's almost 11,000 times the size of Singapore. And because it's such a big country, we actually go across all the climatic zones. So we start at the very top with our tropical, we have our subtropical along our coast, we have arid regions. A lot of the centre of Australia is desert. And then we come down to temperate and core temperate, and we also have alpine areas. So we have our snowy mountains as well. Because the country is so big and diverse, we have a diversity of climatic conditions, which means we have a diversity of agricultural production. And our agricultural production goes across virtually every industry sector. In the grain side, very much dominated by wheat, particularly in the west, but we've also got a whole lot of other grains we grow. We grow fruits, we grow nuts, we grow vegetables. On the livestock side, cattle would be our biggest, certainly beef cattle. Then we've got sheep that we have both for wool production, Australia being a major wool producer, and sheep meat. And then, of course, we've got our dairy, poultry. We've got pigs, and we've got other livestock as well. We also have a very strong fisheries sector because we're an island, so surrounded by sea, and forestry is also very big in Australia. So you can see that our diversity goes across not just climatic conditions, but also across each of those sectors. And what this means is that when we come to developing our policies and when we actually come to engage in the world with what my role is around trade and market access, we say that one size doesn't fit all. And particularly when it comes to sustainability, we really look at outcomes focus, not prescriptive focus. And, quite often we will look to the EU, and while the EU is not our biggest market, the EU being the biggest trading bloc globally, is very influential on other markets. Our markets generally are towards Southeast Asia. They're our closest markets, and that's where it's growing for us. But Southeast Asia will be highly influenced by the policies that come through the EU, particularly what are there within the Green Deal and the Farm Reform. So we say it's actually important to have place-based solutions. The way I farm in southeastern Australia is very different to the way someone would farm beef cattle only 50 or 100 kilometres away. And so we've got to actually accommodate that diversity of environments, and we've got to take a whole of systems approach. And this is something that I've been saying more and more as I've been working in this area, that we can't just focus on agricultural research. We've actually got to think about how that fits with science and innovation and the broader system. And it's not just about research and development. It's about commercialisation. It's about the consumers. It's about marketing. It's about the language that we use to make sure that people understand that what we do, we're in the business of really producing food and fibre. And people can't live without food. We've got actually also in Australia is look at incentives. Now, Australia is one of the very few countries in the world where our farmers are not subsidised. So we don't have the equivalent of a cap. We don't have the equivalent of any sort of subsidies. So when we actually are starting to try and get our farmers to understand what sustainability means, we've got to do more than just say this is about innovative approaches, because we've actually got to demonstrate not just increased productivity, but increased profitability. And that makes the big difference to our farmers. And if you can't demonstrate increased profitability, and quite often it's only the early adopters that will actually get that price premium, then what are the incentives that we may need to put into place? So that's something that's from a policy perspective at the moment is something we're considering. In terms of markets, and Niels, you talked about this in terms of carbon markets, we have now got what we call our ACCU system, which is the Australian Carbon Credit Units. And this is our carbon market. It's still in development, but what we are starting to see is more and more farmers actually understand that then when we're farming in Australia, and of course we're open grazing because we've got so much land, it's not intensive, particularly for cattle and sheep, that it is about what can we sequester as well as what are we actually generating in terms of emissions. So there's very much a line debate with our carbon markets about not just offsets, but insets. So not just about getting our carbon credit certificates and selling them, but to actually say, let's hold them and offset against what other emissions we might be producing on the farm. And this whole system process is particularly important when you think about the interaction between energy and biodiversity and waste. And so it's really important to actually look at that whole picture. The innovative approach we have in Australia to our research and development is what we call our research and development corporation model. So the way our agricultural research is undertaken in Australia is we have what's called a matching model. So we have 15 different research and development corporations that go across a whole lot of different industry sectors. And the idea is that they will be very sector-specific in terms of how they focus their R&D. And we have industry levies. So when you sell your produce, you will actually be charged a levy, and that money is then matched by our government. And that's invested in research and development. But because it's a matching dollar model, industry very much has a say about where they want the priorities to be for that research and development. These RDCs actually partner then with universities and other research providers to actually undertake the R&D, and we're seeing a stronger emphasis now on commercialisation and how we can actually take products to market to be able to make them viable. We've also got in Australia our climate change and agriculture. So we've got a climate change statement, and under that statement six sectoral plans. One of them is for agriculture. The others relate to energy, transport, LULUCF, of course, land use and land use change and forestry. And these sectoral plans are what we're actually now consulting at the moment. Energy is the first public rate because it's what we call our low-hanging fruit in Australia. There'll be a lot of gains to be made as the changes we make in the energy sector. But the next biggest emitter is agriculture. So that's why we're now starting to focus on what that means for our agricultural emissions. We've also done some work, and this was undertaken by our agricultural research and national body, ABARES, which actually looked at how do we compare globally. And of course, one of the things that I've just talked about is our diversity of environment and the fact that we're not subsidised. So this particular report actually looked at a whole range of indicators and adjusted them for diversity and for no subsidies. And what that actually shows is in Australia, we've actually got quite strong sustainability credentials. But it's also important to think about what's the baseline. So what's the measurement? And when these factors, when these indicators were actually adjusted, it actually shows that we've done a lot over the decades to shift land use into nature conservation. So a lot of us as farmers have actually locked up places on our properties to say, for riparian land, to stop erosion and things like that, done a lot of tree planting. In our grain sector, we've had no and low till farming for decades. We have a lot of stubble retention in our grain sector. We're starting to look at alternative products and seasonal cropping to make sure we get the best use of, the cropping that goes into the land. We actually don't use that much nitrogen fertiliser. I was in Ireland last year and I was actually fascinated when they told me about the challenges they had around nitrogen fertiliser. And I'd gone across I'd taken a bus ride across the country. And I'd said to them, I said, I haven't seen one dam. And they laughed at me and they said, we don't need dams in Ireland. It rains all the time. In Australia, of course, it doesn't rain all the time in many areas and we need dams to capture water. But what that means is because it rains so much that they get huge leaching and they need to put more and more nitrogen fertiliser. And I think that for me is a really good example of how we can't have one set of policy that is going to fit every place in the world. We actually don't use a lot of pesticides or a lot of chemicals. And when you think of it, if we're not subsidised, it comes down to how much it costs you to happen. So we spend a lot of time as farmers on things like soil testing and other measurement and data to say, how much do we actually need to use? When do we use it? Because we're not going to spend any more money than we need to unless it's absolutely necessary. And of course, having such a large land mass means that we have much lower stocking rates. The other innovation we have developed in Australia, and look, this looks a bit complex at the moment, but let me talk through it, is we've developed something called the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework. Now, this is a snapshot, an overview of what we're doing around sustainability in Australia. And it actually has 17 different principles, but importantly, it aligns with economic resilience, environmental stewardship, people, animals, and community. So it speaks the language of ESG, which is what the corporates around the world we've been talking about and reporting against for a long time now. Even more important, it actually aligns with the global language of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, when you actually align it with that, we then can start to say, well, how do we actually compare with what others are doing? Interestingly, I'm going to Canada in a few weeks' time, and Canada, their government has actually said they want Canada to come up with a sustainability framework, and they've asked Australia to actually go and talk to them about this, share this with them, and can this be a way forward for Canada? Each of those, across that sustainability framework, they drop down to each individual framework. Now, as I said, there's no one size fits all. What works for beef might not work for sheep, might not work for dairy. So under each of those individual industry sector sustainability frameworks, we have what is fit for purpose for that industry sector. And they will be different depending on how that sector operates. So, for example, in the beef sustainability framework, I'm a beef cattle farmer, so that's the one I know best. There's been a lot of focus on methane emissions reduction. So Australia spent a lot of money and effort in feed additives. So you may have heard of something called asparagopsis, which is red seaweed, and all the trials in the use of red seaweed in feed can actually reduce methane emissions by up to 90%. So that's huge. The thing is that works fine in feedlots. So that's great for dairies, for feedlot operations. But how do you do it in a country like Australia where most of our animals graze in the open? And particularly in the north where you might only see your livestock once a year, if that, it might only be when you put them on the truck to sell. So there's also a lot of research going around pasture and the sort of grasses that can actually reduce emissions. There's work going on around vaccines, although I think it's probably fair to say, and I saw some work on this recently at the university, was vaccines going to be a long way away. There's work going on boluses and feed blocks, but there's also some really interesting work going on genetics. And for genetics, the benefits are both permanent and cumulative. So the gains that we can actually get in genetics are really going to be quite game-changing. Of course, if you go along the supply chain, there's also benefits that will come from energy. And if I look at dairies, they use a lot of energy. So using renewable energy is going to reduce emissions there. And then, of course, in our north, we have savanna burning, which is also going to be a benefit. We heard this morning about complementary proteins, and I did want to actually just touch on this because I've been following this debate really closely. And I have to say, if I go back a couple of years ago, there was very much a view that I was getting when I was speaking at success that alternative proteins were going to be in the future. You weren't going to be eating red meat. Red meat's bad for climate change, and we've got to turn everyone into a vegan. I think what I'm seeing now is a much more nuanced and sophisticated debate around this. And we saw that this morning with the different sides of the debate we're getting around complementary proteins, around plant-based proteins, around lab-based or cultivated meats. And I think that, to me, that's a really good thing because there has to be choice. But what we need to do is make sure that people have informed choice, and we haven't necessarily had that work being done around what's the comparison in the nutritional value of these different options. What's the difference in the environmental footprint? What's the safety? Because if you can actually undertake that work, then what you do then is you allow the consumer to choose. That might be based on affordability, but then if you think about our developing countries, it's going to be around access and equity. So there's a lot of work that our national science body is undertaking around complementary proteins. There's also work that FAO being worried here is undertaking on comparisons, and they're doing it under the SDGs as poverty and hunger. We've also got Australian companies that are really starting to look at using their unused vegetables, turning them into things like protein powder. So you're getting many more alternatives that are going to be actually able to provide the protein where people need it, but are also using things such as waste. And I want to touch on waste because I think waste is something that is such an important, critical part when we talk about sustainability. In Australia, we generate over 7.5 million tonnes of food waste. Our farming sector actually has 22% of total food waste. And what we're starting to see is our farmers, particularly in the horticulture sector, for example, try and think about how they can use other parts of the vegetables, whole of crop. So, for example, if they're producing broccoli, how can they use the stalks? How can they use the leaves rather than just, have it become food waste? The other part of food waste, which I think is really important, and you've probably seen it here, but we see it very much in Australia, and that is we've actually got to touch the hearts of consumers. Agriculture quite often gets pointed at as being the blame contributing to climate change, and that we need to do something about this. And so my response is yes, agriculture can and must be part of the solution, but this has to be a shared responsibility. And there's a lot that consumers can do to reduce food waste, which is huge. And in Australia, fresh produce is about 50% of all of our food waste. And of course, by doing that, you actually reduce emissions, which you keep the waste out of landfill and recycling. Along with food recycling, we're doing a lot of work in Australia about using food waste. I saw once again an example of this only a few weeks ago, where they were using food waste that they were collecting from the town to actually make into animal feed to feed chickens. So a good example of how the circular economy works. And we actually have a national policy on food waste because we see it as so critical. The other piece of work that we're doing in Australia that is actually very advanced is in our traceability. Australia is an island, as I said, and so biosecurity is so important to us, but so is the traceability. And for so long, we've been saying that if we are going to be able to demonstrate our clean and green claims, particularly for trade and market access, we've got to be able to demonstrate that with credentials, and traceability, our traceability system actually provides that. So, for example, all of my cattle have an electronic device in their ear. They can be tracked all the way through, and that is being tracked right the way through from paddock to plate. It means if anything happens, if there is an incursion anywhere at all, they can track where those animals are, they can stop the truck, they can pick it up in a feedlot, they can pick it up in a sale yard. It doesn't shut the whole country down. So traceability is critically important for us. And what we're finding is that the data that is coming from that is really going to be able to provide good credentials to track right along the supply chain. So there are enormous opportunities when it comes to innovation. As I said, we heard a lot about some really great projects this morning. And for me, I just wanted to touch on that policy side, but really say that it's actually got to apply right down the value chain. It's got to actually apply to the whole of the bioeconomy. We're finding in Australia that there's now so much work being done around predictive agriculture, the use of AI, the use of machine learning. Data is becoming essential in terms of measurement and tools. But something that I heard Mildred talked about that, and perhaps you can touch on it in terms of compliance burden. But as a farmer myself, I always say that we know we need to meet the challenges of climate. We know we need to actually demonstrate our claims to sustainability, but there's a huge compliance burden to that. And then she talked about the amount of regulation we need in the EU under the Green Deal and Farm Reform. We have a lot of regulation in Australia as well. So one of the things we're starting to look at is something called data interoperability. So that is, what is the opportunity where you actually can gather data once and report many times. So you actually have systems that talk to each other, so that the farmer is not needing to collect data multiple times. That data can actually be gathered through remote sensing, through satellite imagery, through other AI, to actually then provide that back to the farmer to say, can you verify this? And on a permissions basis, do you allow this to be reported? So that's where we're putting a lot of our effort into at the moment. And then collaboration is so important, and that's the sharing of R&D. You know, I say agricultural research is an international enterprise. And one of the questions that came up, Annie, in your panel was, you know, what role does government have? And so another innovation that we have in Australia is around how we actually help our developing countries in Southeast Asia and in Africa. And that is, we actually have a model that through our international aid program, we have an organisation called the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research that actually funds projects in developing countries. It's a partnership model, and it's about capacity building in country. Very strong one of those focus on young people and women, but recognising that that actually makes a difference if you can embed it in country. And then, you know, why am I here? Because no single country has all of the expertise. So as much as me coming and sharing with you what we're doing in Australia, it is about learning and hearing. And every time I hear someone speak or have a conversation, I learn something new that I can take back. So where to now? Well, in Australia, as I said, we've got a lot more work to do on sustainability, and that's at the strategic and operational level, and that's what's happening now. Greater collaboration globally, where so much is happening now. And even nationally, so whenever I speak to industry groups, I actually say, leave your ego at the door. This isn't just about your industry sector. This is about Australian agriculture, and particularly how do we look through global leaders. Innovation is absolutely critical, but so is international engagement. And it is about what can we learn about the measures what can we learn about monitoring and evaluation. I'm going to the Netherlands tomorrow because I'm interested in what they're doing around benchmarking. In Canada, I'm interested in what they're doing around their indices and their measurement calculators, and how do I take that back to the New Zealand. So thank you. And we must have